Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Business Fun Podcast. This is a special episode because it's going to be the first time that we spent the entire time talking about one specific topic, which is the marketing and sales funnel. If you've been following along lately, I have been doing a survey in the Talking Tickets Slack channel, Talking Tickets newsletter, all over the place to ask people what are some of the important things that they want to learn more about. And a consistent theme was the sales funnel and kind of understanding how you get people into the sales funnel, how you manage the sales funnel, how you get people to reach the bottom of it, which means they give you money or they take some action that you would like them to take. So I have my friend Oli Shawyer from Australia on because he has been working on this topic consistently for the last year or more as he's worked on developing two markets where the AFL has not historically been strong in Queensland and New South Wales. So we talked about all kinds of great stuff around the sales funnel. This one is really, really deep. We talk about how you define your sales funnel. We covered ground on, why ROI might be an overrated measurement of success. We talked about what the bottom of the funnel looks like, how these things play into retention, how retention and acquisition need to be thought differently, how you need to create a different path for your consumers who are only going to view you on TV versus if they're going to buy a subscription or a season pass or something of that nature. We talk about what to do in a recession, how to make a decision about your marketing and advertising budget during a recession. What might be interesting for a lot of people is we talked about how if you invest in marketing now, you aren't just spending that money and throwing it away for the future. You can actually spend marketing dollars and advertising dollars now to drive revenue that may be able to help you bridge a bit of the gap that a lot of people are dealing with between where they are now and where they hope to be in the future. We talked about a lot of stuff here. We've gotten to the, how the investment in marketing compounds over time. We talked about how you can have a negative compounding impact if you choose the wrong channels on your advertising. We talked about the emotional aspects of the sale. We talked about the emotional aspects of what people are dealing with now and how that might impact the sales. We talked about the hierarchy of needs. This is like a really, really deep dive into the sales funnel. So this is like a really, really interesting conversation. By the way, I'm going to post this conversation on Thursday night, which is, forget the date, the 13th of August. If you haven't already, make sure you take a second to check out my newsletter. It comes out on Friday, so in about 5 or 6 hours from now, whenever I finally get the audio of this posted. You can get it at talkingtickets.substack.com. It is a new home for the newsletter. It gives me a little bit greater functionality. It's going to probably give me the chance to do a few more cool things there. But it's 5 stories typically from the week with some analysis, some action items, and some ways to position you and your business built on and based on trends and ideas that are showing up in the feed or in my reading, in my conversations with folks, wherever. So make sure you check that out. Also, make sure you go over and check out my friends at Booking Protect. Sophie, who is handling the social media campaigns right now, has been doing an incredible job of curating really awesome pictures from live shows from around the world with really inspiring quotes from artists and people in the industry. It's great. It is a great reminder of the fact that at some point we will have live events again. We will be able to cheer our teams on. We will be able to sing songs to our favorite artists. in my case, yell back at them. So check them out at bookingprotect.com. There is some great content on the blog. Kat wrote a great piece about managing and maintaining your relationships after the pandemic. It's really essential reading right now. She did a really great job of putting together some ideas. I think that'll be really, really actionable for people. And if you haven't already decided on giving people refund protection, it's maybe a good idea to think through now, because one of the challenges people are going to be dealing with coming back from this is trust, and trust in the events are going to be able to happen, trust in whether or not they're going to get sick. There's a psychological component to this that I think is going to be a big challenge to overcome, and giving people peace of mind can be a tremendous asset for them now. At the same time, make sure you check out what my buddies Einar and Martin and all of their team at Activity Stream have done, because they have pulled together the We Will Recover initiative. You can find it at wewillrecover.live. They brought together folks from around the industry, people like knuckleheads like me, Audience View, QQ, Intix, Booking Protect put something up recently. It's a great initiative. Wholeheartedly support them in every way possible. Frederick Awad and I did the very first masterclass that they put together on revenue and finding new revenue after the pandemic, which you can still find there. Check it out, wewillrecover.live. Now I've got one more thing to share with you. Today's Thursday, I said the 13th of August, and as I have just finished up to, there's a new project that I've signed on to help out with through the end of the year. As many of you know, in the United States, we're having an election in November. And I've found out this year, this is great, my grandfather served in World War II, and he had 3 Purple Hearts. And I've always been someone who, I don't care who you believe in, I just want you to vote. And I want you to participate in the democratic process, and I want you to participate in your communities. I want you to support your communities. So I've signed on to help former podcast guest Lawrence Purrier from Light is on the board of an organization called I Voted Concerts, and you can find them at ivotedconcerts.com. It's a great effort where if you show that you vote, send a selfie to the organization. There's concerts with people and artists all over the country, big and small. It's a great effort. Check it out. Go to ivotedconcerts.com. There are ways to get involved, financially, donate your time, your energies, your ideas. Artists can support, musicians can support, athletes can support this thing. It's really important. It's a nonpartisan thing. It is built entirely on getting people to register to vote and to get them to vote, because being able to vote is one thing. If you're not registered, it's pointless. If you're registered and you don't use the power of your vote, that's bad. Voting is like the dues that we have to and should pay to have a democracy. Voting participation in the United States is one of the lowest amongst all modern economies and westernized countries. So Emily White and her team have worked really hard to pull this together. I'm excited to support this, and I hope you'll check it out. So ivotedconcerts.com. Finally, this episode with Oli Shawyer, I think it's fantastic. I will love to get your feedback about this if you found it helpful, because Oli covers like so many great ideas about the sales funnel. So I've talked enough now. Here's my conversation with Oli. I'm welcoming back Oli Shawyer to the Business of Fun podcast. Oli, we've already gone 90 minutes before we even started recording. We probably left so much on the cutting room floor. But it's nice to have you back on the podcast. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad I can say that to you because you have been sending me notes and emails and texts to ask me if I'm safe. So thanks for being here, and I'm glad. It's nice to talk to you and spend so much time with you today.
Thanks for having me, mate. And apologies for chewing your ear off for near an hour and a half, which is fine for me because it's in the morning, but probably not so much for you.
I told you the challenge is I got to put the boy to bed in a little bit, so. But that's okay. It doesn't matter. He probably can put himself to bed at this point. It's fine. But
have you gotten to a point where you're giving him your previous podcast as bedtime stories?
No, he doesn't want to hear anything from me. Come on. He's had enough of me by the end of the day. Actually, we spent all day together because there was like some serious thunderstorms and it rained out. Like he's been able to go to an all sports camp where they social distance. They have a pod of 8 kids. So he's been able to do that. But today the weather did not cooperate because it's outside. So we hung out.
There you go.
We did some shopping. We did some goofing off. We had some pizza for lunch. He had a great day. I had fun too.
Just rub it in.
Yeah, well, you're still getting started with your day, so that's how this goes. But I'm excited to talk to you today because I've been doing a survey in the Talking Tickets newsletter, and one of the interesting things that people have been asking me about is about the sales funnel. And I know that you have a background, obviously in sports, working for the AFL now and Port Adelaide before. But you come from an agency background, and you have a really strong grounding in the fundamentals of demand generation and turning demand into revenue, which, is always something I'm talking about here. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about the sales funnel and, how people can recreate one now or create a new one if they don't have a fully formed one or a carefully thought out one. Because I think it's become a question that people have been sending me quite regularly. And so it's a chance to be able to have a podcast conversation that's around a subject that is really interesting to people because most of the time we kind of go all over the place wherever the feeling leads us. And today we're going to do really about the sales funnel, if you're okay with that.
Yeah. It's funny. I talk about experience in agency. And again, I don't know if it's necessarily universal for other people that have worked in agency, but found in my time of dealing with client briefs, you rarely actually referred to any form of sales funnel. You'd get your briefs, which would have clear objectives, and those objectives might be something along the lines of raising awareness or driving consideration, or even to the end of that funnel process of driving conversion. But you never really saw it as a sequential step. And it's really only since probably going into client side that, albeit there are those that like to herald the death of the sales funnel and that, it's such a dated model couldn't possibly work in the new age. I've actually found that it's probably been one of the more important tools, not just for kind of being able to address, and picture the idea of somebody kind of moving through a process to get to an end zone, but certainly in terms of actually being able to focus energy and efforts. And, I think everybody, particularly now and probably for the foreseeable future, will be limited with resource and probably quite hamstrung with what they do have. And so focus is going to be more important than ever, and have found a lot of good experience and the ability to be able to leverage a sales funnel to drive those conversations is something that I think will become more important moving forward.
Yeah. So let me start out then by let's define what a simplified sales funnel is going to look like for people, right? Because from my experience, you're going to have above the funnel, right? So because you have to get people into the funnel. Then you have the top of the funnel, the middle, and then at the bottom, you're squeezing people and converting them into sales. Is that how you have approached it, or am I missing a step in there? Can you break it down to us, in the way that you would approach it?
Yeah, I think there's certainly not whilst there's a universal theory and tool to use, I don't think necessarily that it has to be the same steps for everyone. I think it should be very dependent on the industry that you work in, the category, And again, bearing in mind your audiences from start to finish. And so you can predominantly address a sales funnel or a customer journey with whatever fits your world. I tend to try and keep mine at least quite simple, and probably kind of fits those models and theories that have dated 50 years ago, and working along those key metrics of awareness, interest, consideration, trial perhaps, and then conversion. And really, I've always tried to dress it up as either a bucket, that gets kind of thinner as it goes towards the bottom, or something that my old business partner and I used to love to talk about, was this idea of a leaky pipe. So you've got if you're a plumber, and you've got a pipe and you're pushing all the water through the top of the pipe, but only so much is coming out the bottom. At some point throughout that journey down the pipeline, you're losing a ton of water somewhere, and your job is to find out where that actually exists. So that's a model that's worked really well for me. And I haven't seen too much of it when it comes to sports marketing by way of theory, but it's as appropriate for thinking about fan development. So how you ultimately get somebody engaged and aware of the game, then get them interested into it, and then all the way down through to the bottom of conversion, and particularly in the AFL is getting them to either buy a ticket to go to a game, or ideally, better case scenario would be to have them buy a membership, for one of the leading clubs in the AFL.
No, that's a great explanation, and I'm glad that you kind of showed different ways, right? Because again, I think the terminology people can get hung up on, because they maybe have a belief that it's a one-size-fits-all solution, right? The sales funnel should look like every other sales funnel, and that's not, in my experience, not exactly right, because some of them are way more complex, right? But it all begins with getting people in the very top. And so from your point of view, right, and I know that you spent a lot of time on this lately because you have been working on developing some of the markets that the AFL hasn't been as strong in historically. How do you get people into that top of the funnel? How do you generate awareness from folks?
It's a really good question, and probably one the AFL's still asking me to answer. Jokes aside, I think, there's
the jokes
many
are always
different...
mine, man. Come on. That's my job.
Yeah. Particularly now, and I think it's probably fair to say that globally, there will be, particularly as, again, resources dry up to a certain extent, and the last probably, I would say, 3 to 4, 5, 6 months has been so focused on looking after those that are currently in the system. So how do we actually retain all the fans and all the members that are currently consuming our game, so that we don't lose them to the game for good, and ultimately lose them to other entertainment options, or worst case, other sports. And again, depending on how deeply ingrained they are as a fan, will determine the type of substitutable product that they may go to. But with such a core focus, and again with so much concentration put on that, ultimately what can happen is you do such a good job of looking after the people that currently exist that are probably naturally going to churn at some stage, that you don't start filling the bucket. So when those people do churn out, which I think will be accelerated a little bit throughout this period, I don't want to say that things are going to change dramatically for good, but particularly for those lighter consuming audiences, which I think for anybody that's listened to our previous podcast, you'll know that I'm a big advocate for probably the prioritization and the importance of those lighter consuming audiences, because they probably make up core of it. Much to everybody's belief that there's select few that financially underpin a huge amount of clubs' resources. The reality is that there's a whole bunch of people that like to only consume kind of 1 or 2 games a year, whether that be TV or live. And so the reality is, if you lose them and you're not refilling the bucket, you're going to end up with a lot more churn downstream, and it may not be immediately, but come a year, 2 years, 3 years, that customer lifetime value gets eroded, and you end up actually having more churn with less new acquisition and predominantly just end up with a much flatter bottom line. So that's a somewhat of a concern, and certainly a conversation that everyone around the world needs to be having, is not just focusing on, what's happening with our current base, but what are we doing to secure and generate interest in the game, in this instance in Aussie rules, for the future, so that we are at the same time as converting the demand that currently exists, we're stimulating demand for the next generation. And I'm not just necessarily talking about the next generation by way of 10 years. I'm talking about 2-3 years' time, where we're going to need to rely on these new people finding our game and consuming our game, and ideally pushing them down that funnel. And, we're not going to push everyone. I think there's an obsession with this belief that we need to, for everybody that's consuming 2 games, we need to get them to consume 3 games, But the reality is that a lot of people will just stay at 2 games. Maybe they'll go back to 1. Our job at the very least should be defending, that current consumption, and make sure that if they've consumed 2 games this year, they consume 2 games next year. So at least that we're not declining. And when it comes to generating interest, and again, like it's kind of different, I find, for New South Wales and Queensland, which are the markets I look after. They're not traditional footy states like Victoria, WA, South Australia. There isn't that organic attachment. There isn't that organic share of voice in market. You don't have the visibility that you do when you've got 600 journos covering, our game in Victoria versus, a handful in New South Wales. You have to think very differently. You have to be very considerate of the reality of how the audience are positioned and kind of how they consume their time, because they're not as obsessed with footy as they are in those states that have grown up with it, where their parents have grown up with it. So our points of entry into the sport needs to be less about the on-field product and more about the entertainment, the social perspective of it. I think that social perspective is going to become ever more important for club and league strategies in the near future, particularly as people shift from this state of mind around the world as we enter a recession. And I guess in the instance of Australia, we're in a recession. Eventually we'll move out of that safety needs perspective and start pursuing more emotional needs like a sense of belonging, entertainment, socialization. So, it's going to be really important to be able to leverage that and how a game of footy, whether it be live or watching it on TV, playing footy, whether or not that's about going and joining your mates down at the park to have a game, again, all socially distanced. These are all the types of things that we need to think about and be really mindful of the motivations of the people that we're trying to speak to ensure that we're actually positioning ourselves aligned with the need states that they have, rather than kind of building it and just assuming they're going to come.
Okay. Let me ask you 3 things about the top of the funnel, because that was a very comprehensive answer. And I think we're doing a great job of defining the sales funnel here. I think we're doing actually 4 questions. Take that back. The first one is, you talked about lifetime customer value. And I know that this is going to be a brand new thing for a lot of people, because they haven't been listening to me, but all of a sudden Gary Vee started talking about it. And so now it must make sense. Even though, Gary Vee and I have come up together over the years through like the same group of, marketers. Define lifetime customer value for me in a way that people can make sense of, and put it in the context of why it's so important, because I don't think that it gets explained very well.
Well, you really put me on the spot with definitions and outlining, key principles of certain fundamental models. And, there will be, people out there that are much smarter and much better marketers than I that will hear these answers and go, what is she talking about? So perhaps I might start to sound like Gary Vee. So customer lifetime value in its simplest essence is again trying to whole picture of an individual rather than the short-term picture. So I think that, it's, say, for instance, if we're talking about a sports fan, there might be this, obsession to look at what they're spending now, and they might only spend $30 on a ticket throughout the year, which you can clearly measure. But if they do that over 10 years, that's $300 that they're worth. And then if you're in a position where you've got your data properly set up and ability to actually match and have a single customer view, the reality is that person could also be spending $300 in the retail store. They could be spending, $30 a month on a subscription TV product just to watch your games on TV. But, so I think there's still a long way to go for businesses to be able to clearly match that and have a full understanding of exactly how their fans or their members are behaving. And so it's really just about, rather than looking at one single transaction that can be easily measured for a customer, you're being mindful of actually how much are they spending in total, and over time, how much is that worth to the business? Because you can make a whole big song and dance about somebody that might spend $800 this year, but for whatever reason, you lose them to the system and they don't spend another dollar with you for 9 years. But then if you've got somebody that will spend, $300 with you in 1 year and they'll do that with you for 5 years, that customer is, economically speaking, worth more to you than that person that's spending that much with you on one. So it's really important that you're just being very mindful of the reality of how people spend their money, the fact that, time and individual circumstances can change, and that they're likely to spend different amounts with you in different ways over time. And that at the end of the day, every customer is probably just as important as the last. And again, I want to echo how important those light consuming audiences are, because initially, as an individual that needs to focus on generating more revenue, it's human nature to go to the person that's spending most with you right now, because they're predominantly going to make you look better at the end of the year when it comes to generating and turning around your sales targets. But, that there might be more people spending less, and them in total comparison are worth a lot more than that individual. And it's just really important to make sure that you've got a grasp of that.
I that was being a trick question. You did a great job. And I'm going to try to simplify it for people. It's, through what I heard you say, which is you gotta be willing to break down the silo and saying, oh, well, I just got to get everybody to spend $30 on merchandise. And it never translates to, well, this person spent $50 on ticketing for the family, then spent another $30 on merchandise, and then they spent $25 on F&B. So then instead of looking at each of them as individual points, you're going, well, shoot, I got, what is that? My math is here, 50 and 30 is 80 bucks, right? Then you're going, well, that's great. And if I can get them to come, and it comes twice a year, that's $160. So then if I work on it, and that's a per person, so let's say a family of 4, so then whatever that is, $640, right? So then how do I get them to come back, right? And so then because that's exponential growth, right? Or am I wrong?
No, most definitely. But I think that's,
that was a rhetorical question, by the way.
there's no, it's certainly no fault of anyone's, because I think, just the environment tends to drive us to focus on kind of, smaller keyholes to look through, whether or not it's
easy to measure
the data structure there. Yeah, definitely. And, it's eluding and attracting to go towards somebody that looks to be spending a lot of money than having to do the hard work to figure out how much in total everyone's spending. But, tech will advance, and I think particularly throughout this period of time where, clubs and leagues around the world will look at their strategies and look at their ecosystems to figure out how can we get better and more sophisticated at what we're doing. And these are the types of things that will evolve because of it.
Right. And I know that, and I say that all of those things in a way, because I know they're difficult, right? It's not lost on me. But why I illustrated the point that way, it's because I think you can look at customers maybe as having a little less value than they do if you only look at them through a siloed lens. Because it's hard, because it is difficult sometimes to collate all the data. That's why some of these membership programs and rewards programs and all these things are so valuable, because you can give somebody something that really has a nominal value to you but seems extremely incredible to the person, and it helps you pull that data together so you get a more comprehensive picture of people. Because
definitely,
at least in my view, right, we're overwhelmed with data right now. And the problem that we are dealing with when we're talking about all this data is that we don't have a way to make the data meaningful, because it comes from 100 different places. it's like a spigot, a fire hose just beating us to death. And there hasn't been a concerted effort or enough attention paid to making that data look like an avatar, I guess, to use a simplified term.
Yeah.
But by looking at the customer like I just did, where I said, oh, just these 3 revenue sources, you combine it alone doesn't look impressive, but when you put it together, you're like, well, that's pretty great, right? That's a pretty good spin from a person. And to get that out of them, that's awesome. So then now I have a different approach to how I'm dealing with that customer, as opposed to, kind of cookie cuttering everybody the same way, because everybody looks very similar in the different rows and bands of pricing that they're sitting in. But that's just me.
But look, you're right, and again, I won't harp on about it in this because I'm pretty sure we spoke about it. But this elevates how important the role of segmentation is. In making sure that you aren't approaching every fan, every spectator, or every member, as a cookie cutter clone of the person next to him. The reality is everybody has different context, everybody has different needs and wants, and whilst there's ways to clump those together, at the end of the day, you need to be really clear about how these people differ, or how they are similar, so that you can actually align your strategies and your ability to go to market in a more effective way. And I'm not going to say efficient way, because I think, that's the beauty of data, is it allows you to be more efficient, but it's actually about being more effective, which is ultimately where you're going to generate more revenue.
Yeah. Now, this next question is 2 parts, because I said I'd give you 4. So this is going to be counted as 2 and 3, and call this poetic license, if you will. But Australia is dealing with, you talked about the recession first. They're dealing with the first recession in about 30 years. Is that right? At maybe 27, 28, 30 years, somewhere in there, right? Like official recession? Because you were pretty much...
I'll say yes.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure when the last recession was, but it sounds about right.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you were lucky in that, like, the financial crisis in 2008 didn't really heavily impact Australia. So yes, there, the part 1, 2A, and then number 3 is knowing that there is a recession going on. The tendency for people is to pull back on all of their marketing and their demand generating efforts. Is that a bad idea, or is that the worst idea ever?
It's a good question. It's a very good question, and one that
it's also a leading question, because I've given you the answer.
Yeah. I feel like you're spiking the volleyball here for me. I just finished reading a wonderful book, actually, called The Roadside MBA. I'm currently studying my MBA, and actually through a mutual contact of ours, Ben Newton, mentioned, he posted something on Twitter that he was reading it, so I picked it up, and one of the things that these guys talk about a lot with regards to when they go to answer important business questions is the answer should always be, it depends. So I'm going to throw that back to you and say it depends on individual brands' circumstances. So what I mean by that is, if you are on the verge of survival, like if you've got no cash in the business, if you're potentially at risk of going into administration, if you're significantly unable to supply your product to the increased demand, like, for instance, airlines at the moment, right? I think that 100% you should be pulling back and cutting costs where you can. You're in survival mode, right? Like, if you can't provide your product, and, I think it could be fair to say in some sports around the world, it's futile to invest or to increase your investment in driving live consumption by way of spectatorship at the stadium. But, there's room to say, well, it doesn't mean you should stop altogether. If you've got the capacity, if you've got budget, if you've got cash in the business, then I think it is 100% worth investing, either holding your budget and not cutting in your costs, or if you can afford, increasing your costs. Increasing your marketing and advertising investment. And I say that not based on pure subjectivity, but simply because out of many recessions over many decades, there is a well of theory and body of work that has showcased through data and through actual evidence that those brands that do invest, if they can afford to invest in promoting their brands, not only do they come out of the recession in a much better place, they're able to recover from the current recession much quicker. So, if you can afford to, if I were in charge, like from a CEO perspective, and I had cash in the bank, and somebody came to me and said, "Oh, we're going to cut all our marketing costs," then I would be saying we don't need to do that. In fact, now is a wonderful opportunity to actually increase our investment in it, because all our competitors are likely going to be cutting their costs unless they've also got really smart marketers in the business. And because they'll be cutting their costs, it increases our opportunity to increase our share of voice, which is massively important for increase in market share. But also you can do it all at a lot cheaper per unit price. Costs for advertising and media will plummet because that's often what most people do when it comes to any form of economic issue, is that they cut costs in marketing and advertising. And I think, again, in our previous conversation, we spoke a lot about how important it is for marketing to position itself in the business, particularly when it comes to advertising and promotions and paid media, for that to be seen as, for lack of a better word, as an investment rather than a cost. Because the reality is that you're more likely to make more money on that investment at a time when people are pulling out.
Right, and this is true, and this is why I want to highlight this that spending money now is an investment, because not only do you get it cheaper now, but the data shows there's a tremendous halo effect from the money that you invest during a recession that translate into continued share of voice, top of mind awareness, intentionality that transfers for, I don't know the exact number, but it's at least 2 or 3 years after the recession ends, if not longer. So, I mean, the data is very, very clear on this. So like if you have the opportunity, it is a tremendous time to, in the case of like a lot of organizations that probably can't put on shows or games with fans there, and they don't have a clear indication of when they can, it is still a good idea because you can generate revenue through memberships, through merchandise sales, through any number of different ways. So it's not like you're just advertising and throwing the money into a void. You can still use it to make money, and maybe it's money that bridges the gap for you.
Yeah, and I think probably the really important thing to call out right now is that, like any form of investment into promoting and getting your brand out there, it's not just about generating immediate return on that. And I think that particularly in the last probably decade, with the rise of digital, there's probably too much of an obsession with the return on investment and being able to clearly measure that. In saying that, well, we put $100 in and we got $105 back. It's very difficult to be able to measure all forms of advertising accurately, but that's not to say it doesn't work. And again, going back to that light user, that new user, that top of funnel stuff, the reality is that we can't always assume or be in a position to talk to people that are currently in the market. The reality is you've got to stimulate that demand for the future so that when they do enter the market, they're more primed to be aware of your product or your brand, to have more of an understanding as to exactly what it is that you do and the benefits that you might address. And I think that's really important right now. And not just right now, it's really important forever. And there's always there's this never-ending debate in the industry about brand building versus sales activation. And, do you do all of one and none of the other? And the reality is it's always about a balance, so there will be some businesses that are capable, like FMCG businesses right now, of actually investing to generate even more demand right now and to convert on that demand right now. But the reality is, there's a job to also do for setting ourselves up in a year or two. And so, you bring it back to the AFL right now, all across the country, there's many differing ways of people to be able to consume footy in Victoria, which is where I'm at. There's none except via TV. We can't go to stadiums like you can in some capacity around the country. You can't play footy. So from a participation perspective, in most parts of Victoria, particularly in Melbourne, you can't play footy at the moment. So just because you can't convert that demand right now and you can't capitalize on that now, it doesn't mean that you just disappear altogether, because if you disappear altogether, what's going to happen when in a year's time that this is all available, or in 24 months' time when this is all available? You can't just assume that you can turn a tap on and they'll all come back if you've been non-existent in their life for 2 years. So it's really, really important that you're in the market, your share of voice is generating, the ability to convert now, but more importantly, to be able to stimulate that demand for the future. And that feeds right back into your sales funnel. If you're capable of measuring that, if you've got real clear brand tracking in place, you'll know and you'll start to see the impact of disappearing altogether. And it means that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gone for good, but it means that you're going to have to work even harder in the future if you've just disappeared altogether now.
Yeah. So I was, as you were answering this, I was thinking about, when Mark Ritson has his next MBA and he adds the podcast to each of the sections for the sales funnel, he's going to have this one, because you're doing a great job of explaining the importance of the sales funnel and feeding people into the top. One final
full credit to just to give a plug there, because I mentioned that I really didn't start taking the sales funnel seriously by way of an applicable model until I moved client side. And the reality is I did Mark's mini MBA course subject marketing before I went to client side. And I got to tell you, if I hadn't have done that, I think I would be a very different marketer. It was phenomenal. It changed my entire way of working and how I approach working. And, he speaks very fondly of the sales funnel and its ability to empower businesses if you do it right. And even though it's a model that's dated, 40, 50 years, however long, and I'm not going to credit who came up with it because I can't remember, but it is as applicable today as it ever has been. Well done, Mark.
Next time I'm in Melbourne, me, you, Mark, and Ryan Wallman, we'll have to all get together and have some drinks. It'll be awesome.
That would be
amazing,
that
right?
would be lovely.
Final question on the top of the funnel, because what I don't want to dumb it down for anybody, but I also don't want to assume everybody knows exactly how these things look. What does it look like when you captured somebody in the top of the funnel?
It's a good question. I think probably one thing to call out is how different people's time in that funnel can change. And it does seem to make sense that it would follow like a certain process, but you could be aware of the game. Next day you're going to a game to trial it, and then you might then consider it, and so it's as linear as it is in some instances. I think people can move around slightly differently. It's not like a perfect model, and I think that's really important. But yeah, look, I think if you're going back to the top of funnel, and if you're trying to get people into that funnel, and once you've kind of got them into that funnel and they're aware of the game, from an individual's perspective, they're probably more alert to seeing communications, from that said brand. So if I'm aware of the AFL, I might suddenly start to notice, TVCs about the AFL. I might suddenly notice, more goalposts on fields around Melbourne. If you're in any of those traditional states, you'll see the 4 posts on the fields rather than the rugby posts in New South Wales and Queensland. As an individual, you might start to, potentially do a little bit of research to understand a little bit more about the game. So look, the behaviours are tenfold. There are so many different ways to go about kind of how you act on that awareness, and again, how quickly you might do it. They'll go from being aware of it to trying to determine or answer whether or not they're interested in it, really. And there's a lot that don't. There are a lot in it's crazy to think, but there are people in Melbourne, which is the birthplace of footy, that are clearly aware of
started
the
game. Come on, let's not.
Yeah.
I mean, Tom Parker,
well,
he's going to, and Tom Newton are going to be glad to hear this.
Yeah. But there are a lot of people aware of the game, but they're not interested in it. So the job is, once you've kind of done your exercise, your far-reaching exercise, and leveraging all the touch points you have to make sure that everybody and anybody is aware of the game, is, well, how do you make it how do you position it in the market to ensure that it aligns with people's interests? How do you get them interested in the game? And as I said at the top of the conversation, that is slightly different in a state where you're kind of just consumed by footy all the time because it's in the paper, it's on the TV, it's on the radio. People are playing it in the fields when, they're kicking around a Sharon, which is an Aussie rules football, when you see them at the park. It's very different. Whereas in Sydney, you won't see people kicking around a Sharon necessarily. You don't flip over the back page and see, an Aussie rules or an AFL story there. You won't turn on the radio or the network news at night time and the first story be about kind of the competition. So, yeah, I think, you've got to find ways of generating interest in it that aren't necessarily about the product itself.
Right. And the key point is that getting people into the top of the funnel is difficult to quantify, but it doesn't mean that you don't focus on it, because awareness is valuable later because, and I'm sure we'll get to this in a minute, people are so fascinated with ROI, like you said, and then it becomes this quest for last click attribution. And what falls by the wayside during all this is all the money that has been invested in getting it so that when you post that ad on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, that people will pay attention to what you did and they will take that action. Because that doesn't happen just because they see it on Facebook. It's not like somebody in Sydney is all of a sudden going to go
somewhere else.
They're not going to go, all of a sudden I'm going to not go to the NBL. I'm going to see the Swans. No, that's not how that works, because you have to nurture people. And there's a lot of time where it's just tilling the land, to use a metaphor that maybe doesn't translate around the world. But, you just have to sit there. And the top of the funnel is a lot of times you're investing in efforts that you don't know exactly what's working or what's not, because the intent to buy hasn't necessarily registered in somebody's head yet.
That's exactly right. And I think that's where,
I'm almost knowing what I talk about sometimes.
Yeah. But too many have suggested that if you can't measure it, or you can't define how it's working, then it's wasted. But, again, it goes back to that whole idea of needing to talk to people before they're in the category, so that when they get into the category, they're more likely, to understand that, the role that product or brand has to play, and therefore more likely to purchase it because they're familiar with it. And we know how important it is, to be able to remove some of the thinking for people to help them make decisions. But I think just very quickly going back to that point about awareness, and I think unfortunately for us as marketers, it's a term that's used all too freely and fluidly that even in the boardroom, people go, yeah, I fucking get it. I get it. It's about generating awareness. But at the end of the day, I don't really care, because I'm talking about sales here and our bottom line. And you keep talking about this puffery up here. So our job as marketers, and again, it's very difficult, and you've got to keep working at figuring out how you can measure it to be able to then present it. But is to use language that the board or the CEO want to hear. And, so being able to marry up things like awareness with key measures of market share or penetration, like we as marketers have done ourselves out of being taken seriously far too often, that our job now is to try and figure out how we can make our language marry up with the language that matters in those, important big boy, big girl tables, so that we're taken seriously.
Money,
and that,
all about outcomes, all about it.
Yeah, just like
things that are measurable that tie to revenue.
Yeah, everything, at the end of the day, and again, I'm pretty sure we spoke about this at length, either offline or in the podcast last time, but if there's any marketer out there that doesn't want to believe that their job is about making money, then they're in the wrong business, because that is solely what our job is to do. And our job in terms of managing the comms internally is about saying, well, it's not just about making money now, it's about positioning ourselves to make money in the future as well.
Yeah. If you've done your job right, every year it's like planting seed. And so you're going to see it grow. So for every dollar, you might get, for every dollar I spend on marketing in the first year, I might get $1.50 back. The second year, if I do it and I'm consistent and I have clear branding, a strong value proposition, I'm consistent, and I'm cultivating an audience, I might see $2 for every dollar I invest in marketing.
Yeah.
By the third year, I may be hitting $4 or $5. You know, and that's not valuable,
and that,
I don't know what is.
That's exactly right. But I think here's the other thing, and this comes down to, again, our ability to measure, but also not looking through that siloed keyhole, is you might invest, let's say, for instance, you invest, and this is just for argument's sake, $500,000 in outdoor advertising, in a given year. That's really difficult to measure in terms of its final impact on sales. But let's say you're in a position to be able to measure the ROI on that, and it comes back that actually you can only deliver 0.5 on the dollar, right? If you make that decision within that one financial year, of course you're going to say that's a complete waste of money. Like, look, we're losing money on that expense, particularly when you then look at Facebook. We invested $100,000 on that, but we made $200,000 through that. Again, there's two things happening. One is obviously the link between that outdoor ad and that last click, through the Facebook thing. But the point being is, if you then take a step back, and this is really hard because most people are just career marketers, so they're only in the business for 2 or 3 years, and that's a problem. But if you take a step back and you look at that outdoor investment and you're able to properly measure it across time, it's actually about the exponential return on that investment over time. So you might see 0.5 on the dollar in that first year. By the third year, it might be $2 or $3 because you've been able to nurture. You've been able to plant that seed in many people that weren't in that category many years ago and now suddenly in it, and they're more primed and ready to buy because of years of being exposed to the brand. So I think it's really, really important that when we do look at ROI, and again, it's a dangerous metric to solely base ourselves on, and in fact, it's not an objective, it's an outcome. But if you do look at it properly. Then look at it over the course of a lifetime, as opposed to just within a point of time that suits the financials of the business. You've got to be able to have those conversations properly.
Yeah, I think one of the keys here for marketers or for executives that are listening to this thing is that if you need somebody to explain the value of marketing to you, call me or Oli, because we're going to tell. I'm not joking, actually. You should, because we will explain it to you in terms that you can understand. Because if you think that your investment in marketing is going to be resolved and you're going to be absolved of responsibility by the money you spend in just 1 year, and that it's like a quick fix, that's not really you're going to end up spending money on things like Facebook or at the cost of everything else. And as soon as you either can't or don't spend the money on Facebook, or you've reached the end of the line on Facebook because you haven't been investing in things like customer retention or growing, your market share, it's going to become less and less effective. So the opposite impact is going to happen, right? So if you spend $100,000 on Facebook this year and you get $200,000 back and you throw everything else away, next year you're going to spend $100,000 back and you're going to get $150,000 back. Not enough to necessarily go, what the hell's going on here? By the third year, though, you're likely spending $100,000 to get $50,000 back because you've trained people to ignore you.
Well, that's right, and it goes back to the conversation that we had earlier. Is that if you're not refilling the bucket and pushing people into that funnel and further down the funnel, then the reality is you're asking your performance marketing to work much harder than it needs to if it were in collaboration with proper brand building activity. And I think just on that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with spending money on Facebook. There's absolutely nothing wrong with spending money on TikTok or, whatever, Instagram Reels or, whatever the new fad is. But
it has to fit in your strategy, and you have to have one.
That's exactly right. It's got to be in your strategy, and it's got to be part of an integrated marketing comms plan. You've got to be really careful and considerate of who your audience is, what are you asking them to do, and then defining the most appropriate way to reach them and get them to do that. I think that it's not to say that any channel is better than any. This isn't a case of digital's better than above the line or, TV's better. It's not about that. Everything works really well if it's used properly and in collaboration with the other tools. And I think there's, again, wells of body of evidence that says that if you have two channels working for you, it's exponentially better than just having one. So you've just always got to be thinking about that, rather than just assuming there's a silver bullet or a silver channel that's going to deliver you the best bang for buck. It doesn't work like that.
There's no silver bullet. That is like the thing. If we can disabuse everybody of, there's no silver bullet. There are sugar highs, but there are no silver bullets.
A lot of sugar highs.
Yeah. All right. So because I've told you too that I have to put my son to bed in a little bit, we're going to have to rush. I don't know if we have to rush through these things, but I want to move on to the middle of the funnel, right? Help people understand a little bit about the middle of the funnel, because I think really, actually, probably the most important thing for people to understand was that top of the funnel thing, but I don't want to not get to the bottom and the middle.
Yeah, and look, again, the middle of the funnel can look very, very differently for a lot of people, depending on kind of the industry and the category that you exist in. And again, I think the reality is if you look at it as some form of progressive approach, if you're talking about the middle of the funnel, you're assuming that people are aware of your product, they're interested in your product or your brand because they're still in the funnel. Otherwise, they're not in your funnel. It then becomes more about, you start to shift towards trying to drive specific behaviors, and whether or not that be, capitalizing on their consideration. If suddenly, okay, I'll put it in the context of Aussie rules football. From a competitive set, we don't just compete with, other sports. We compete with everybody's entertainment, their choices of entertainment and how they, choose to use their disposable income, which I may add is probably going to get a little bit tighter for a little while, because that's the reality of what happens in a recession is your discretionary spend gets pulled back. But the reality is your job is to ensure as a marketer that a game of Aussie rules is part of that consideration set. And, I always like to frame it up when I'm, either working with the clubs or talking to others in the team, is that if I wake up on a Saturday morning and there happens to be a Sydney Swans game on that day in Sydney, whether it be in the afternoon or night, I want that individual to wake up knowing that there's a game. So when they ask themselves, what am I going to do with my time today? Going to a Sydney Swans match is part of that consideration of how they could possibly use that time. And then it's about if it's their first time, it's about, pursuing the trial, and whether or not that be through watching it on TV, whether it be through, going to an actual game, or if you want to go back into the participation piece, how do you get people to pop down and have a kick around the footy? How do you get them to trial what it might be like, whether it be watching a local game of footy and defining whether or not it is that they want to play in that. So, you're likely to drive trial. Your focus is to get people to trial. If they've already done that, then obviously you're starting to talk about how can you get them to either now purchase or repeat purchase. And throughout all of that is this need to help support them in their evaluation of their experience. And I think everybody's really, really good at nurturing audiences when you have access to them, but sometimes you won't. So how do you actually help get them to either rank their experience? How do they ultimately go about defining whether or not it's something that they want to do again? So, that real middle funnel stuff is they've either had a taste of something or they're about to taste something, and our job is to make sure that we make it the best possible experience for them.
Bang. All right, so let's move down to my favorite part, right? Because it's attached to the money, and I agree with you though. ROI is something a bit of a gimmick now that's kind of overused, overfed. Because I often tell people, if you just want a high ROI, I can do that, and your business will be worse off than before I got here. That's not what we're trying to do here. But the bottom of the funnel is where the money comes. What does that look like from your point of view? Can you explain it to people?
Yeah, so when we're talking about kind of the bottom of the funnel stuff, we're talking about, physical consumption or participation in the game. So, if you go from a community footy perspective, where they've registered to play in a team, whether or not that be if they're younger and they do it through one of our Auskick programs, whether or not they do it through one of our school programs, if they're at school, whether or not they sign up to a junior footy team or a senior footy team. I am, since moving to Melbourne, have started playing footy again. So, that for me would be a masters team. And I'm not going to define the criteria of what it means by masters, but predominantly it means that you're old. So as embarrassingly as
so
it is,
that would be in the
reality.
senior footy league, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, no. Senior footy is kind of over 18s, and then there's masters, which is you could continue to play senior footy, or if you're either not prepared for that sort of level of competition, or expense on the body. I unfortunately have had a lot of injuries in my time playing footy many years ago, so I probably can't and shouldn't be playing footy. So I play masters, which is just a slightly addressed product of the game, which we play every second week rather than every week, and the rules are slightly different to try and mitigate injury, and probably more importantly, help us address our lack of fitness. So point being is, when you're down in the bottom of the funnel, you're either trying to get people to participate in the game. If they've played 1 year, you want them to play another year. So, again, that's probably more around that retention piece rather than acquisition. If you're in clubland, you're obviously wanting people to buy a ticket to one of your games at your stadium, or if they're got more affinity to the club itself, and they've gone past that spectator personalization, they're now moving into that fan piece. Then you obviously want them to start thinking about becoming a member, and so you're trying to encourage them and convert them to buying a membership. And again, on the basis that they've done that for 1 year, conversion the second year might actually look about, that's about retention rather than acquisition necessarily. So, I think the hardest thing about sport, and again, I can't pretend to know necessarily what it's like for other industries because, I haven't had to manage different brands, but there are many different ways to consume sport, which means that there are many different ways to look at conversion. And I guess that ladders back up to kind of your core business objectives, and then what your marketing objectives are as to where you're going to focus your efforts and energies on, about what's the most important piece of conversion, you should be pursuing, and whether or not that be to watch more on TV, to go to more games live as a spectator, to buy more memberships as a fan. So, that's when you start kind of getting into the heavy grit of it, which is predominantly where, the core revenue is. And understandably, because that's where the core revenue is, it's where a lot of people spend most of their time.
And I was going to say, a thing that I think it pays a little bit of attention to is that in a lot of cases, you have to make sure that you're careful about the way you think about the TV audience and how you convert them to a different form of participation. Because what we see in a lot of places is that the TV attention, the willingness to watch a game on TV, it's a struggle to convert that to actual attendance. And that's partly built through the way the funnel is set up, because you are nurturing them and driving them towards converting to TV watchers. At the same time, you're not breaking them off or giving them a path that directly and meaningfully sends them towards buying the ticket.
But I think that's a really important point there. And again, it comes down to, if you've done your marketing strategy right and you know who the core segments are that you're focusing your efforts on, then that purchase funnel might be slightly different. Where, for somebody that, is likely to be a member, obviously the end game for those people is to predominantly get them to as many games as possible by way of conversion. But and again, I've seen some fantastic work, and in fact, a very good friend and mentor of mine, Professor Heath McDonald, has done some amazing research around the rise of the media fan, the media dominant fan. And, old fan development models seem to suggest that, watching a game on TV was the precursor for the end game of getting people to go, to games. Like that's the ultimate objective is, watching TV is a step on that journey. But actually there's a lot of people, and again, this is why it's so important to understand who your audiences are, that are never going to come to a game. And in fact, again, going back to that customer lifetime value, just because they're not spending money on going to the game, they could be your biggest fan watching every game on TV, spending so much money on retail. Are you not going to pay attention to them or focus your efforts to address that proposition and their needs because they don't come to a game? Most definitely not. And particularly sports become more global, there are so many people around the world that are massive fans of clubs and brands that will never be able to go to a live game, but it's really important to commercialize them, and to ensure that their affinity with the club, is aligned with the ability of what they can actually enact by way of behavior. So, again, I think whilst traditionally it's been looked upon, particularly for clubs, you don't want to heavily promote TV viewership because you want people to come to the game. But the reality is, if there's an audience segment out there that their end behavior is only going to be that, you've got to be able to cater to that too. Yeah. Particularly as, the rise of how people consume sport. We've spoken about it. The industry speaks about it all the time, about the changing nature of consuming sport and, the drop in live attendance. And, there is a lot of different nuanced challenges to address with that. But you can do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize one audience, at the expense of another, whilst also commercializing all of it.
Yeah, no, that's I think a great place to leave it because, again, we could go on. We've already been going for 2.5 hours. I think my wife's going to kill me. Oli, where can I point people to find you? And first, but before you say that, thank you for being so willing to come on and talk about the sales funnel. People have been asking about this. There's a lot of interest in figuring it out and thinking through it more thoughtfully. The bottom of the funnel probably needs its own episode, like we ended up at the top. We'll get to that. That'll be the next one. But thank you so much for doing this too. I
thank you, man.
I got 3 or 4 pages of notes here. That was great. And now, how do people find you so they can give you the applaud and the support that I'm giving you?
Look, I'm just on the usual suspects. So Twitter, just Oli Shawyer, and LinkedIn. And then I do have a website which I'm trying to find more time to write through, which is just olivershawyer.com. But that's predominantly where I'm at.
Awesome.
Particularly given that I'm in lockdown and not able to physically go anywhere.
Yeah, well, ain't that the same for all of us? Oli, man,
yeah.
Be safe. Thank you so much for doing this, man.
Thanks, pal. Cheers, everyone.
Let me know what you thought of this conversation I just had, and you just listened to with Oli Shawyer. Hit me up. It's dave@davewakeman.com. That's my email address. Check out my website. It's davewakeman.com. You can find my blog. You can find all the stuff I've done, all the stuff I'm going to do. I'm trying to add some new elements to it, but it's crazy to figure out exactly what I want to add right now. So analysis paralysis is hardcore on the website, but the basics are there. There's a blog, there's email address, there's cool stuff. Check it out, davewakeman.com. Make sure you follow me on the social media. I'm at David Wakeman on Twitter, and like I've said for many, 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 many times before, if you know the guy who has the Dave Wakeman Twitter handle, get it for me. I'd appreciate it. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Instagram. They actually upgraded me to a business account the other day. I don't know why. Really, all you ever see is like things if I'm traveling or if I'm cooking something. But, or I guess now if I'm taking my kids for a ride and we do something funny. So that's what you get on the Instagram feed. But I'd love to have you follow me there too. It's great. Make sure you connect with my friends and partners. Check out Booking Protect. The blog is great. Like I said, the Kat wrote up an article about relationships, especially managing and rebuilding these relationships after the pandemic. I think it's super important. I think it's a really great message, and I think it's something we need to really think about because we sometimes, from conversations I've had with organizations around the world, sometimes we think that the relationships may be stronger than they are with our customers, or they're more superficial than they probably should be. A lot of people have spent a lot of time on relationship building, and they have seen the return on that time and energy. So focus on those relationships. You can check that out at bookingprotect.com. If you haven't thought about giving people, offering refund protection at your venue or for your events, now is probably maybe a good time to consider it. Talk to Kat, talk to Simon, talk to Kath, talk to Abby. The entire team is just tremendous. They're great, nicest people in the world, and so grateful for their friendship and their support over the years. The same goes for Einar and Martin and the team at Activity Stream. as soon as the pandemic hit, they started working on putting together the We Will Recover initiative to help people have a resource to find out about new ideas, new content, new ways to help get their venues and their teams and their organizations back online after the pandemic. I know this is an extremely stressful time for everybody. I know that the end can often feel like it's never going to come. The We Will Recover project has been a way for people to have things to focus on that are positive. I worked on a webinar, the first masterclass webinar with Frederick Awad from Stay 22 on revenue and new revenue streams. There have been great things and great people involved, like Angela and Joe from the Ticketing Professionals Conference in Australia, Andrew and Carol at TPC in the UK, QQ, NTIX, Made Media, me, and some really, really great folks. So check that out, wewillrecover.live. And finally, if you don't already have it, maybe you want to check out my Talking Tickets newsletter. It comes out every Friday. It's 5 stories most of the time with some analysis and some action items. I say sometimes because every now and then I'll just put a bunch of links that didn't have a theme that I saw throughout the week or a trend that that hooked onto them. So sometimes I'll just throw some interesting stories that I had as the 5th item. Always some analysis, some action items, and some stuff that you can use to put to work in your business. It's important, like I've mentioned before, keep putting one foot in front of the other. If you need somebody to talk to, though, don't feel like you need to go through this alone. Talk to me, right? Send me an email at my email address. It's dave@davewakeman.com. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Reach out to any of the trade associations, any of the people in my network, or everybody I know wants to be there and support everybody. This is something that none of us have a playbook for, because none of us have experienced anything like this before. It's a mental strain, it's emotional strain. There can be ups and downs, even if you're me. No, I'm joking. Everybody, even when you don't feel it, it's important to reach out to your community, to stay connected to folks, to feel part of a community right now. So if I can be that for you, make sure that you use me as that resource. So hit me up, dave@davewakeman.com. Again, it's been so nice the last 6 weeks since I started putting out regular podcasts again, to hear from you, to see you, to have a chance to talk to people again. I'm so thankful for all of you that listen, to the podcast, read the newsletter, are in the Slack channel, who do all these things. It helps me deal with the day-to-day and sort of sameness of things right now, and I hope it does the same for you. I get emotional at the end of these things, like I'm a changed man over here during the pandemic, but I'm so grateful for you sharing a little bit of your time with me. Thank you again. I will see you soon. My voice is going on me because I was on the phone with Oli for 3 hours. So if I sound a little subdued, don't worry. It was just Oli kept me talking for 3 hours. Until next time, take it easy. I'll talk to you all soon. All right. Be safe.